He has said a little before that the apostate angels, by their revolt, and all the reprobate, as far as they themselves were concerned, did what God willed not, but in regard to his omnipotence, it was impossible for them to do so. For while they act against the will of God, his will is accomplished in them. Hence he exclaims, quote, "Great is the work of God, exquisite in all he wills, so that in a manner wondrous and ineffable, that is not done without his will, which is done contrary to it, because it could not be done if he did not permit. Nor does he permit it unwillingly, but willingly. Nor would he, who is good, permit evil to be done, were he not omnipotent to bring good out of evil." End quote. Section 4. In the same way is solved, or rather spontaneously vanishes, another objection, viz., if God not only uses the agency of the wicked, but also governs their counsels and affections, he is the author of all their sins, and therefore men, in executing what God has decreed, are unjustly condemned, because they are obeying his will. Here, will is improperly confounded with precept, though it is obvious from innumerable examples that there is the greatest difference between them. When Absalom defiled his father's bed, though God was pleased thus to avenge the adultery of David, he did not therefore enjoin an abandoned son to commit incest, unless, perhaps, in respect of David, as David himself says of Shimei's curses. For while he confesses that Shimei acts by the order of God, he by no means commends the obedience as if that petulant dog had been yielding obedience to a divine command, but recognizing in his tongue the scourge of God, he submits patiently to be chastised. Thus we must hold that while by means of the wicked God performs what he has secretly decreed, they are not excusable as if they were obeying his precept, which of set purpose they violate according to their lust. How these things which men do perversely are of God, and are ruled by his secret providence, is strikingly shown in the election of King Jeroboam, 1 Kings 12:20, in which the rashness and infatuation of the people are severely condemned for perverting the order sanctioned by God, and perfidiously revolting from the family of David. And yet we know that it was God's will that Jeroboam should be anointed. Hence the apparent contradiction in the words of Hosea, Hosea 8:4, 13:11. Because while God complained that the kingdom was erected without his knowledge and against his will, he elsewhere declares that he had given King Jeroboam in his anger. How shall we reconcile the two things? That Jeroboam's reign was not of God, and yet God appointed him king. In this way, the people could not revolt from the family of David without shaking off a yoke divinely imposed on them, and yet God himself was not deprived of the power of thus punishing the ingratitude of Solomon. We, therefore, see how God, while not willing treachery, with another view justly wills the revolt. And hence Jeroboam, by unexpectedly receiving the sacred unction, is urged to aspire to the kingdom. For this reason the sacred history says that God stirred up an enemy to deprive the son of Solomon of part of the kingdom, 1 Kings 11:23. Let the reader diligently ponder both points, how, as it was the will of God that the people should be ruled by the hand of one king, their being rent into two parties was contrary to his will, and yet this same will originated the revolt. For certainly, when Jeroboam, who had no such thought, is urged by the prophet verbally, and by the oil of unction, to hope for the kingdom, the thing was not done without the knowledge or against the will of God, who had expressly commanded it. And yet the rebellion of the people is justly condemned, because it was against the will of God that they revolted from the posterity of David. For this reason, it is afterwards added that when Rehoboam haughtily spurned the prayers of the people, quote, "the cause was from the Lord, that he might perform his saying, which the Lord spoke by Ahijah," end quote, 1 Kings 12:15. See how sacred unity was violated against the will of God, while at the same time, with his will, the 10 tribes were alienated from the son of Solomon. To this might be added another similar example, viz., the murder of the sons of Ahab, and the extermination of his whole progeny by the consent, or rather the active agency of the people. Jehu says truly, quote, "There shall fall unto the earth nothing of the word of the Lord, which the Lord spoke concerning the house of Ahab, for the Lord has done that which he spake by his servant Elijah." End quote. 2 Kings 10:10. And yet with good reason he upbraids the citizens of Samaria for having lent their assistance. Quote, "Ye be righteous. Behold, I conspired against my master, and slew him. But who slew all these?" End quote. If I mistake not, I have already shown clearly how the same act at once betrays the guilt of man and manifests the righteousness of God. Modest minds will always be satisfied with Augustine's answer, quote, "Since the Father delivered up the Son, Christ his own body, and Judas his master, how, in such a case, is God just, and man guilty, but just because in the one act which they did, the reasons for which they did it are different?" End quote. If any are not perfectly satisfied with this explanation, viz., that there is no concurrence between God and man, when by his righteous impulse man does what he ought not to do, let them give heed to what Augustine elsewhere observes, quote, "Who can refrain from trembling at those judgments when God does according to his pleasure, even in the hearts of the wicked, at the same time rendering to them according to their deeds?" End quote. And certainly in regard to the treachery of Judas, there is just as little ground to throw the blame of the crime upon God, because he was both pleased that his son should be delivered up to death, and did deliver him, as to ascribe to Judas the praise of our redemption. Hence Augustine in another place truly observes that when God makes his scrutiny, he looks not to what men could do, or to what they did, but to what they wished to do, thus taking account of their will and purpose. Those to whom this seems harsh had better consider how far their captiousness is entitled to any toleration, while, on the ground of its exceeding their capacity, they reject a matter which is clearly taught in Scripture, and complain of the enunciation of truths which, if they were not useful to be known, God never would have ordered his prophets and apostles to teach. Our true wisdom is to embrace with meek docility, and without reservation, whatever the Holy Scriptures have delivered. Those who indulge their petulance, a petulance manifestly directed against God, are undeserving of a longer refutation.